Overcoming myths and objections. Our manager knows all about energy efficiency. I've heard this a lot in my 2.5-decade career, touching 3 billion square feet of real estate. Our manager knows all about energy efficiency. This guy doesn't even know enough to wear a belt. Couldn't resist putting this picture in there. In any case, what do you really say? Was it wise to depend on your manager for this? I mean, let's think about this. One of the questions I've posed to my prospects when they give me some of this stuff is I say, listen, do you have your manager do your housekeeping? And they say, well, no. Well, do you have your manager do your landscaping? And they said, no. Why not? Because both housekeeping and landscaping require specific skills and tools as well as time. So now you have to ask yourself, does your property manager have the skills, the tools, the time to do justice to this important value creation activity? The answer's got to be no in most cases, right? Does your manager even have the time or inclination to stay up to date on all building technologies and efficiency strategies? The answer most certainly is no, unless the person has a side job as an energy consultant, right? Does he have experience with dozens or even or ideally hundreds of similar buildings so he can evaluate your relative performance? Probably not. You know, there's this old saying that I'm not sure who discovered water, but I'm pretty sure it wasn't a fish. And taking that comic saw and saying, wait a second, if an energy manager or if a property manager is only living in his own building and he doesn't really have anything to compare it to, how efficient is, how accurate is he going to be in judging his relative efficiency if he's never actually studied or worked in any other building? Does your manager have access to the most current studies documenting non-utility cost financial and non-financial savings? I can tell you beyond a shadow of a doubt, in many cases, it's going to take quantifying and monetizing those non-utility cost financial savings and bringing to the table the non-financial savings to get all those people upstairs, the portfolio managers, the asset managers, chief financial officers, to take note of what could be perceived as a fringe project. Number 8. Does your manager tend to evaluate projects based on simple payback period? Holy cow, if you've listened to some of the other lessons in the financial analysis, you'll realize how fundamentally flawed simple payback period is. And unless the manager has capital budgeting training, they may not know to ask the contractors and other vendors for a more sophisticated measure than simple payback period. Is your manager comfortable calculating and explaining to ownership net present value, savings investor ratio, and life cycle cost? Because those are the things that are going to set you free. Those are the things that are going to help justify a higher first cost premium efficiency improvement that actually has lower life cycle cost and actually represents a higher return per invested dollar for ownership. Number 10, has your manager even read the leases lately? In many organizations in real estate, the manager, who's the property manager, is different from the leasing manager. And the property managers may have never read the leases. Or if anything, they've read the lease abstracts. Unfortunately, the lease abstracts are only summaries of leases. So they may not actually go into the nuances of whether or not the owner can pass through the expenses involved with, capital expenses involved with reducing the energy consumption in the building. Do they clearly understand who would pay and who would benefit from efficiency improvements in both the tenant spaces and the common areas if you were to proceed with this energy initiative that you're talking about? If they haven't looked at the leases, they may not know. Have they explained to any vendors that their recommendations need to be delineated based on whether the energy loads are tenant or landlord related? Is the manager familiar with the nuances of CapEx cost recovery? I mentioned that earlier. How many things are they allowed to pass the expenses through for? And can they calculate what those expense recoveries would be versus what the projected savings would be? In other words, how much the tenants would really see of the savings based on the split of cost and savings laid out by the existing leases. Do they know precisely how the costs and savings of energy efficiency measures would be reflected in the year-end lease accounting? Is your manager comfortable extending the analysis to how the investment would positively impact net operating income and asset value? The manager may just be a manager. He may never have really invested in real estate himself. He may not be terribly familiar with the lease formats or the ARGUS, the discounted cash flow models. He may not be that knowledgeable in capitalization rates and what properties are selling for in the neighborhood in this particular property type, in this particular condition. Think about it. Lower landlord share of operating expenses, higher tenant retention and attraction, lower tenant fit-out expenses due to a higher renewal rate, where you basically save money on capital improvements later on in the investment term because you don't have tenants churning as much as you would have if they were dissatisfied with the space. Less demand on CapEx reserves. What are CapEx reserves? We'll talk about this in a later lesson in Selling at 6, but just a quick version. CapEx reserves are the dollars that people put aside. In fact, the appraisers require you to put a portion of net operating income aside to prepare yourself for a rainy day. What happens if the chiller breaks? You're not going to go to the alley and the loan shark and borrow the money for the chiller. So people generally say there's a certain percentage of rents that should be put aside in a CapEx reserve account. Now think about this though. If you are proactively taking these efficiency measures and installing them in your buildings and then wrapping them in a blanket of CapEx cost recovery, now all of a sudden the tenants are paying you back for equipment that you would have had to pay for yourself had you waited for the equipment to fail. So using the CapEx cost recovery mechanism actually reduces the amount of incidents that you'll have to use CapEx reserves to pay for equipment and essentially pay for it out of your own pocket and not get reimbursed from your tenants. How about a potentially lower capitalization rate? This will mean more to you after you take the lessons within Selling at 6 on cap rates and what their impact is on appraised value. But let me just give you the short story right now. The capitalization rate is the rate of return that an investor requires to receive, wants to receive, to accurately reflect the amount of risk they perceive in the building. Okay, if you make the building less prone to technological obsolescence, less exposed to regulatory compliance, less exposed to utility price spikes, with happier tenants, with higher occupancy, with greater renewal probability, one could say they would be, a lot of those dimensions of sustainability would lead an investor to apply a lower capitalization rate, meaning a lower risk-adjusted rate of return to the building, which means, or not a risk-adjusted rate, but a lower rate of return that he wants to get from the building. And as a result, if you divide net operating income by a lower cap rate, you get a higher asset value. So that'll make a lot more sense when you take another a few 6-minute lessons on the income approach to appraisal and more. So bottom line is, you can see how complicated the seemingly easy solution is that the manager should be doing in his spare time. Honestly, the property manager has to be almost a Renaissance man or woman to have enough expertise in energy efficiency, best practices, commissioning, the landlord-tenant splits, the leasing, the CapEx cost recovery, all this other stuff that, frankly, probably was not on his or her resume when they got the job as being property manager. Number 16, do your manager's upgrade recommendations communicate the true costs and benefits to the capital budgeting decision makers? Is your manager comfortable preparing and presenting both of the following documents? A compelling one-page narrative proposal focused on the why, with all the what, how much, and when relegated to a technical appendix. And number 2, a one-page financial analysis highlighting the proper metrics as opposed to the simple payback period, return on investment, or internal rate of return, which you already know from going through the Selling at 6 lessons on financial analysis are fundamentally flawed metrics. Okay? So modified internal rate of return, savings to invest ratio, net present value, life cycle cost analysis if applicable, if you're talking about a mutually exclusive scenario that you're trying to decide on. I mean, these are the kinds of things that your manager has to be comfortable preparing and presenting in order to do justice to the energy efficiency proposal without outside assistance.